um, kind of as we've went into this section, as we went into um, this specific judge, we're in the middle of Gideon. We've ran through several of the judges so far, Ophni, Ehud. Shamgar was one of the minor judges, and then we had Deborah and Barak the time before last. And then last week we spent some time introducing Gideon as a judge and who he is and everything. And so just kind of to review, to recap, what were some things about Gideon or his story that really stood out to you about who he was, about how the story has taken place in chapter 6 specifically? Yeah, he was pretty humble at first. He was like, who am I? I'm the least of my clan, of the least of the tribe. And so, yeah, he did not have much confidence in himself.
However, though, he did a lot of planning.
He did.
He seemed to be strategically minded.
Yes, he did have very strategic mind, and he did whatever God asked him to. He may not had the best faith, but he had faith, and he did whatever God asked him to. Anything else? Yeah. He asked for a lot of signs. And then did God give it to him? He did. So that shows you something about God, who's willing to try to help this man grow his faith to become the person that he is. So that's kind of what we saw through Judges chapter 6. God working on him through either providing signs or having him destroy his father's idol as like a little something that he would be scared to do, but he did anyway, had trust and faith in God. So we're going to get chapter 7, chapter 8. We're going to finish these two chapters today. And so, again, we're not going to have time to read everything, so I really hope you read beforehand as we jump into it. So Judges chapter 7, 1 through 14. So this is the story of kind of the pre-battle before the battle actually takes place. And what did you see in this section? What jumped out at you as you read about kind of God cutting down the number of people who are fighting for him and this dream that takes place? What stood out to you? What questions, comments did you have?
Well, right away in verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me." So God literally tells him why I'm cutting down your army because of this.
Yeah. So he says, I'm going to try to make sure that you have you can't say, or you're not tempted to say, I did this, I defeated the Midianites, I delivered myself. And so he tries to make it, an impossible number. And how many Midianites are they going against? What does it say? It doesn't give a specific number, but it kind of says what they were.
More than Gideon's 30,000.
Yes, more than the 300. It says that they were like locusts on the face of the earth, and that their camels were like grains of sand on the seashore. They were just spread out everywhere. So a lot of Midianites versus 300 Gideons. I think that was the next thing I had on here.
There was one battle he took on. I read, I don't remember where it is, but they were asking, how come you didn't ask us to help you?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right after this. So we'll get there. We'll get there in a second. Good. What else did you see here? I guess the interesting thing, before we move on from this point, is God sends so many people home so that they won't believe in their own strength and instead really remember who God was and who God was to deliver them. The interesting thing is, does that even work towards the end of the story? And that's the thing to remember. And we'll see that more and more. All right, what else did you see here?
In verse 5, how he specifically says, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog from those who kneel down and drink. I've heard that some people say this verse is about their tactic. You know, when your face is in the water, you can't see the enemy.
Right.
Versus when you're drinking with your hand, you can. So,
Right.
But then other people say that is just what God told him to do to separate the different.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, that tactic does work. But I think it's more of just separating the people. Like if you did the other way, then it only gets rid of 300 men. It doesn't really help cut it down. But yeah, good. What else?
He still needed encouragement from God.
Yeah.
After all, he had already done.
Yeah. And what form does that encouragement take place here?
He hears a dream, goes down to.
Yeah. So what's the deal with this dream of a rolling biscuit? What is the deal with that? Like, it's such an odd story. I feel like it's an odd story. Like, yep.
A cake of barley bread meant to be consumed, but instead
Yeah. Yeah, and I find it really interesting that whoever this dreamer's friend was, like this friend tells him a dream about this cake of barley, rolling down and flattening the tent of the Midianites, and then the other guy is like, well, that certainly is Gideon. And I'm like, where do you get that? But this is an interesting thing, and this is not unusual, is God sending dreams to the enemy or to a foreigner. You see this a lot in Genesis, a lot in the Old Testament. But what's very interesting is who's usually the one to interpret it. Yeah, the Israelites, to some extent. So Nebuchadnezzar, you have Daniel. For Pharaoh, you have Joseph. Usually you have an Israelite interpreting the foreigner, pagan dream. But instead you have, a fellow pagan, and Gideon's just overhearing it. It's kind of one of those things that fits into the typology of kind of a hero, but it's just a subtle difference that makes you think, this isn't quite lining up.
That would show the psychology of the enemy. They're defeated before the battle.
I know, which is really interesting, because why would you be scared of Gideon and his 300 men? Like, from a physical standpoint, like...
At the very beginning, Gideon, where are all the miracles we heard about? Where's
Yeah.
the Lord? Why are we in this condition? And I think God's working on him here and showing him, yeah, he's still there.
Yeah,
But where's your faith?
yeah. I think so, 100%. And he will deliver them. So, yeah, good. Anything else in this section? Good.
I just have a footnote about the barley cake here.
Yeah, go for it.
Alluding to the insignificance of Gideon and his family, or perhaps his whole troop, barley then, as it is still, was distinguished from fine flour. To hear himself put a barley cake troubled him not. It matters not how base we be thought, so we be victorious, according to Joseph Paul in the Cambridge Bible.
Yeah, interesting. That's an interesting take. Cool. Okay. You got something?
I still think that the Mennonite probably look at Gideon as just flying on him.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, this vision come upon him and say, hey, this is more than you can see.
Maybe. Do something, Roger?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the barley. That's one of the things the Midianites were coming to steal from the Israelites.
Yeah. And it's like an ironic twist that they get what they were taking. Interesting. Very interesting. And what's more interesting is, like, God over and over has been telling Gideon, I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you. And then he's like, if you don't believe me, go listen to the enemy. And it's from this point, like after this point, he like leaps up and he's like, okay, we got this. It's almost like he believes the enemy more than what God's shown over and over again. I don't know, it's just like question marks around Gideon's character, starting in this section. Anything else before we move on to the next section? Okay. Judges 7:15 through 25. This is the main defeat of the Midianites and the other peoples with them. About them defeating the Midianites. And how do they defeat the Midianites? With great might and strength. How do they defeat them? Yeah. With clay jars and trumpets and torches. That's how they defeat them. Which does that remind you of some other judge that rescued the people with not really a weapon? Shamgar.
Oh.
When he with the pokey stick, he delivered he killed all those people with an ox prod. And you'll see this throughout the Judges, is God uses unusual methods to bring about the deliverance of his people. Also unusual people, as we've also seen. So what in this section did you see? What kind of popped out to you?
It seems like a psychological factor, right? Because he's dividing up in three, separating around, maybe like it's a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, he surrounded the Midianite camp. And normally you wouldn't have, so you would only have a trumpet or a horn for so many men. And so when you have like 300 trumpets being blared out, psychologically you think there's a lot more men there because you're only supposed to have one trumpet per battalion, as we would call it today. So. And so, it's dark, it's chaotic, and so what do? They start fighting the nearest person they see, and they just destroy themselves. Yep. What else here?
A lot of fighting going on.
Yep, there is a lot of
They spend
fighting.
a lot of time in war.
Yep. Well, I mean, when you as a people do not trust in God and are constantly doing the wrong thing, and thus you get put into captivity, then even if you make it right, you cry out to God for help, you still have to fight your way out of it. And it's just really, it's a lot easier just to do the right thing the whole way through. And I think that's part of the lesson here, than going through all this fighting and struggle. What else?
I think you can see that these Midianites were frightened out of their wits. They were so frightened when they looked around and saw that they were surrounded in their minds by thousands of people at this particular hour in the night. And they come up fighting anybody that they ran into. And it's really dangerous to be around a person who is really, really afraid.
Yes.
Because he loses control. He's not rational. It's just fear. It's not paralyzing, but caused him to do anything.
Yep. That's kind of the same thing as like a drowning man will sometimes drown his rescuer because he's just flailing, because he's not in a rational mind, kind of the same way. What about, does anything bother you in this story? So this is a great triumph, that Midian is defeated. I mean, you got to think about the relief that would bring to the country after being under oppression, where they would just come and take, and then whatever they couldn't take, they would just burn or destroy, as far as food and stuff like that. So you're starving, or there's not much there. So you think about the relief that this defeat of Midian would bring to the people. But is there anything in these sections, any of the wordings or phrases that really bothered you?
Chopped off their heads.
Yeah. So bring in the heads. Yeah. So they brought the heads of Orb and Zeb to Gideon. So the Ephraimites do that, which is interesting because it's almost like bringing tribute to Gideon is almost what it's like. But yeah, good. Anything else bother you in this text? Yes. Yes, he does. I don't know. Did he say leave no man alive? I don't see as big deal of Gideon pursuing and destroying the Midianites. You kind of see that with every judge. That's kind of just what you do to make sure they don't come back and counterattack you. I think it is interesting though that Ephraim Ephraim is the strongest of the tribes at this time period. They're the strongest tribe militarily. And then they're not the first ones that answer the call. They only come after Gideon has this great victory. And then they're not even one of the first ones to come after the victory. You have Asher and Naphtali and all these. And then the Ephraimites come after that. And we'll get to that later because that kind of trickles down into chapter 8. But just kind of keep that in mind. Yeah. It was just confusion. It was dark. You see a dark form in front of you. You feel like you're surrounded. You think that they're attacking the camp, and so you just start fighting whoever you see in front of you. And if this is also a conglomeration of Amalekites and Ammonites and Midianites, because that's been mentioned in the beginning of chapter 6, that there was like several different ones, you have not the same kind of clan or people mixed in with each other, and so it's even easier to fight each other. Yes?
It seems to me quite strange. I mean, here's a group of people being going there, destroying their crops, taking everything. It could have, common sense says it's not that many of them. And all of a sudden, you're panicking. I said, well, I see people coming to help them.
Yeah.
That seems kind of strange.
Yeah, that there's this sudden uprising. But it seems like Israel was waiting for God to appoint a judge, because as soon as he did in chapter 6, it seems like everyone came to him. So, I don't know. Go ahead.
Total side note, not even, but where did all these trumpets come from? I mean, 300 trumpets, I know it's irrelevant, but
Yeah.
22,000 what?
So they had 22,000 men at first, and then they had all the trumpets that all the men brought and gave it to the 300.
Because that's how they used to be able to
Communicate on the battlefield.
communicate.
Yeah, and so you usually in that day you would have one trumpet per unit of people, as a captain or something, and so you would be able to communicate with people on the battlefield. Hey, and they would have different trumpet blasts and stuff like that for different things, like we're getting slaughtered over here, we need reinforcements now, or hey, we're pushing forward, we have an opening, like just different things like that. And so instead of just one person, the captain or whatever, having that trumpet for, I don't know how many men, 100 men, 300 men, 500 men. Instead, every man had that. And so that was the deception that there was this whole army that was there.
Well, they all obviously blow.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and it's not really like fine-tuned instrument. It's just like a ram's horn that's been hauled out and that you can do short blast or long blast with. Any?
Found it interesting that they divided the 300 into three companies. And the Roman centurion was the leader of 100 soldiers.
Well, a Roman is leader of 1,000 usually.
Roman's not part of it now.
Yeah. He sent him in 3 different areas, kind of to cover all the areas around the camp.
I'm just thinking, I was just thinking it was unusual that Romans were probably not very well known to the Israelites at all at that time.
Oh, they didn't even exist back at this point. They didn't even exist. This was way before any of that happened. It's a long time ago.
How big is an American company?
Yeah.
What was the object in the pictures being broken?
Noise, I think so. I just figured it was noise. I don't know. Maybe it sounds like something else. I don't know.
They had a torch in one hand and a trumpet in the other. So I thought at first they might use them as a weapon.
Yeah.
Sharp.
They had their swords, so I doubt that was the case. I think part of it was they used the jar to cover the light until they got up close, and then they would a lot of pitchers breaking, 300 pitchers breaking, that would make a pretty loud sound, and just be unique, startle people. It's all about creating confusion and chaos. Yeah. The thing that kind of bothered me throughout this section was all of this, all the times that kind of Gideon got a lot of glory. And he would say occasionally, that arise, for the Lord has given a Midian into your hand. But he says, look at me in verse 17, do likewise when I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do when I blow the trumpet, and I who are with me that blow the trumpets, shout for the Lord and for Gideon. And you could take that one or two ways. You could say, well, Gideon's just trying to communicate with them and be obedient. He's doing what the Lord said, and he's giving glory to God, but he's almost putting himself kind of equal with God. This would be very similar in that day to like Pharaoh and the gods. Pharaoh is a worker, or the gods of Egypt would work through Pharaoh, but Pharaoh is also considered as a god, is equal to him. And so you kind of just have these little question marks where it just doesn't, he seems to be giving himself a little bit too much credit. There's nothing definitive right here in chapter 7, but you'll see, okay, is he really just being obedient and kind of not phrasing it the best maybe, or is this actually his ego starting to go up and him giving more credit to himself? So, yes? Yeah, and that's part of it maybe. And you're trying, and it's one of those things like it's not anything definitive like he's wrong. It just has that's not quite right. So, also, does this sound like any other story that's in the Bible about a group of Israelites circling around a enemy nation and blowing trumpets. Yeah, Jericho. And again, you see this cross between a lot of the Jericho things that take place in Joshua being done, but not in quite the same way as done here. And if you remember what takes place after Jericho, what story takes place? Before Ai. Well, they first go up and go to defeat Ai, and then they get defeated. Because of what reason? Yeah, because there's sin in the camp. Because of Achan. Achan took gold and he took clothing. Keep that in mind as we go to chapter 8, because you'll see that again. He ruins it for all Israel because of that. Yeah.
Do you think that Gideon might have been like a little bit, he only had 300 men, and he went up against what, either 22,000 or 10,000? That was kind of like, how can I do this? And he was kind of, God was with him all the time, but he kept a doubting God on different things. So this might have been a little doubtful thing. How can I do this with 100 men, and I'm going up to over 10,000 men? I mean, that would be a kind of, how can I do this? And he didn't realize that with God, he could do anything.
Yeah, and I think that's part of him growing in faith. And I think after the final dream, he really feels like he can do it. God's with him, all that kind of stuff. And he does, and he defeats them. And I think that's the kind of progression that you see here. And you're just hoping that continues. Good.
Definitely from my understanding, even with the 22,000 or whatever he did before, he wasn't too comfortable because the Ninevites hated him. We're talking about grants of sins to people, right?
Yep.
And then all of a sudden God said, well, you got too many. Send some home. All those friends, send them home.
Right.
And to get it done.
Yep. So that there's no doubt that God is the one that does this. And that's the ironic part. All right, anything else in chapter 7? Okay, so this kind of is a break in who Gideon is. I showed you this last time, that this mirrors the prologue and epilogue. The story of Gideon mirrors the prologue and epilogue. And so the prologue, we saw that Israel fights the enemies, and they also dismember enemies. And then you have Israel facing idolatry. And then you have Gideon facing idolatry, which was the destruction of his father's idol, Baal and Asherah. And then you have them fighting the enemies, which we just read about them overcoming and defeating the Midianites. And then you have what we're about to read is a flip, where it starts instead of look at kind of looking like the prologue, it is looking more like the epilogue. And so Gideon, from this point on, will not fight enemies, but will fight actually Israelites. And then instead of defeating the idolatry, he's going to forge idolatry. He's going to make his own idol, which is just like what Israel is going to do in the end. And so really you have almost the whole cycle of Gideon summed up, or the whole cycle of Judges summed up in Gideon's life. It is the center of this book. It is what everything is kind of based on and turns around. So it's very interesting to look at it in that way. And when you see what Gideon has done so far, he's fought against the Canaanites, he's tore down his father's idols, he's literally done whatever God has said. Even though he could have more faith in it, he's done whatever God has said, and he's given God the credit for it to some extent, at least. But now we're going to see him kind of reverse that, and he's not going to fight against Canaanites, he's going to fight against Israelites, and instead of tearing down idols, he's going to raise up idols, and he's going to give glory a lot more to itself. So that's going to be what we look at in Judges 8. So Judges 8, verses 1 through verse 21. So it's a pretty big chunk there. This is kind of as he runs down the rest of the enemies of the Midianites to really destroy them. And he's just trying to obliterate them. You have a few different things here. You have his discussion, I guess, with Ephraim and solving that. And then you have him and his interactions with two different cities of Succoth and Penuel. And then at the end, you'll have him killing Zabath and Zalmunna, the kings that he's been hunting. So that's kind of a rundown of what's going on in that first section. So what in the first half of chapter 8 stuck up to you? What questions did you have? What was interesting? What was kind of weird? What insights did you have?
Well, you just went through verse 21, and I had noticed that in verse 23, they wanted Gideon to rule over them and his son, and he said, "We're not going to rule over you. God will."
Yeah.
Found that
Yeah. We'll talk about that a little bit more.
that comes later.
Yeah, in the next section, we'll get there. Go ahead.
Well, in verse 6 and 7, when the two other, they said, well, we're not going to help you. Do you have them already? Do you have them captured? But the fact that Gideon turns bitter, he's like, well, I'm going to tear down the village and, show you who's boss when I come back with them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what type of servant of God has that in his heart when he has a mission to do and comes across a little hiccup?
Yeah.
How is that a turn that way?
Yeah, and it's self-injustice. Like, how dare you do this to me? And you see his ego growing. I can't believe you do this to me. Look at all that I've done for you. You are disrespecting me because you're not helping us after I've helped you get rid of these oppressors. And you again show his ego growing more and more and more. What else? I guess we can start here. Why is Ephraim so mad at Gideon? If anything, in my modern mind, I would think Gideon would be mad at Ephraim for not coming immediately. Why is Ephraim mad at Gideon? Yeah, and that's exactly it. So this is an honor-shame culture. It's really foreign to us in the West. We're an innocent guilt culture. And so everything's built on us being innocent or guilty. This is an honor and shame. So everything is built around us, either you gaining honor by the things that you do in life, or shame by the things that you do or not do in life. And so this was they felt like they had shame for not being part of the ones, as again, they were the most powerful tribe, so they were not part of defeating the Midianites. And so that's how Gideon's able to placate them, is basically saying, I just defeated the Midianites, but you got the real honor by killing the Orb and Zeb, the kings. And so he basically placates them and says, what is the honor I have when you have killed the kings? That's the real honor. And then it says their anger against him subsided when he said this. So that's kind of what to think about. And remember, when you're reading any part of the Bible, because this is an honor-shame culture. And it's kind of different than what we're used to thinking. Everything is about your honor. Everything. They would rather die than lose their honor. And that's just how they're function. And so they'll make a big deal about stuff that you don't understand, but it has to do with honor. And that's part of what is going on here. All right. Anything to add to that? Or anything else?
Like spoils of war were kind of important too. Gideon said, aren't your the gleaning of your grapes better than all of my family's grapes?
Yeah.
That's half of the reason their anger subsided.
Yeah.
Partly also they missed out on the spoils of war during his whole time.
Yeah. So they get the and I think that goes with all of it is you get the king, the glory, and all of the kingly stuff that the kings would have with them. What is that compared to what I have had? Aren't your grapes sweeter than my grapes?
I think too, this is an illustration of the point that Gideon's humility turns away wrath from the free.
Yeah.
Because the way Gideon responded to their complaint, what have I done compared to you?
Right.
And really kind of allowed Ephraim's pride to stay in place.
Right. I think this is a really good move by Gideon. I think this is a smart move. I think this is where he shines one of the brightest as far as a leader. Again, like you said, he doesn't have, it seems like, yeah, my victory is better than you, where were you? And it starts fights. Instead, you show what he's capable of being humble and being able to not try to show that he has more honor than Ephraim, but instead is willing to be humble so that he can keep the peace. And I think this is a really bright spot. And I think this is here to compare to the next two times that he comes against someone who is trying to go against him. So, anything else on this argument with Ephraim? Okay. So, what kind of logic did the cities of Succoth and Penuel use? So, what was the story? What did Succoth and Penuel do or not do? They didn't what? Yeah, they refused to give Gideon's tired soldiers resources, bread, water, allowing to rest, that kind of stuff, as he's chasing these. And why is the reason that they didn't do that?
Their lack of faith, Gideon would win. You chasing after these people, and we help you, and then you lose, they're going to take it out on us.
Yes. And so it's really their lack of faith in God, ultimately, is like, yes, they have a lack of faith in Gideon, but the lack of faith of God that he's going to be able to overtake these two and kill them. And so they're really having a very pagan kind of logic. I'm going to, cover my backside so I don't get hit when you lose, or if you don't lose, then great. But I'm not going to give you any aid until I know for sure that it can't get back to harm me. It's a total selfish move. It is not like, let's help our brothers, let's get our freedom, this is the best chance to get from out under his hand, let's help the rest of Israel. No, this is, let me make sure that nothing bad happens to me. And it's a total different selfish kind of attitude that these cities have. Now, is Gideon any better in how he responds, though? Because you have Gideon, and it is kind of mentioned, but you see this change in Gideon because he doesn't say, like, may the Lord, condemn you, or kind of why have you done this thing? The Lord would do that, or bringing, kind of praise and recognition to the Lord. And he says in verses 7, so he does say, when the Lord has given these two kings in my hand, I will flay you with flesh and thorns in the wilderness with briars. Then 9, he says, when I come again in the peace, I will break down this tower. And it's a total opposite. So filleting the elders with thorns and breaking down the tower of these cities was for one thing, and that was to bring shame. Again, honor and shame culture. It's the reverse of what he did Ephraim. Bring shame to these cities that did not help him, that refused to help him. And it's also about him keeping honor, regaining honor, making sure his ego is high. So you don't want to help me. You will be an example to other nations, other cities that will not help me. And that's the whole thing here. It's an I-centered focus. And I will hurt you if you do not help me, which is not very godly.
Seems like he was always in defense of himself. They were always criticizing Gideon. He took a lot of time defending himself and what he did, I thought.
Yeah, he does. He does in some ways. But yeah.
This is a completely different person here too, because previously, before his first battle, he asked for multiple signs. Is this what you want, God? Is this what you want? Is this what you want?
Yeah.
And now, in this situation, he thinks he's the greatest military commander ever. And
Yes.
he's going to go in here and these people shame him, and now he doesn't even ask God, what should I do with these people? He's just like, when I come back, you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
So he's just forgotten about it.
Yes.
This is one battle that clearly God gave him to his hand.
Yes. Yeah, and he's totally forgotten his purpose. His purpose is to free Israel, not, make sure he is honored or fillet them if they don't help you. His purpose is to free Israel. So remember the ornaments. So what does Gideon do after he kills these kings? He takes their ornaments and he takes their clothes. Verse 21, and then the clothes are mentioned in verse 26, I think, something like that. Yeah, and so this is, I think you're supposed to think Achan here. You're supposed to think that kind of thing. Also, what's important is clothes make the man. And so he takes these clothes of kings. You're going to have a lot of that going on. So we got to push into the next section. I lost track of time. So there's a lot happening here. So one, you have everyone coming and saying, look what you've done. Rule over this, you and your sons and your grandsons, for you have saved us from the hand of the Midianite. Did Gideon deliver them from the hand of the Midianite? Yes, but it was through the Lord. There's no mention of God from the Israelites. Now, to Gideon's credit, he does say, I will not rule over you, but the Lord will rule over you. But what does he request? Well, gold earrings. And what story does that sound like? What? Yes. Yeah, your alarm bells should be ringing of a collection of golden earrings making an idol like Aaron did. This is parallel to that. And so this is the exact story you see here. You should know what's going to happen. And they make a golden ephod. This is an idol, and it's a stumbling block. And so instead of destroying idols, he makes an idol. And he has all these purple garments and these collars and everything from the Midianites. And you have this guy that has a bunch of wives and concubines and a bunch of sons. What does that all sound like? What type of people have a bunch of wives and a bunch of concubines and a bunch of sons? Kings. kings. And probably where did he get those wives? Well, he slaughtered a whole city of men in Penuel. So I'm sure some of those came from that. That also sounds like a king. And then to top it all off, he names his son Abimelech. And what does Abimelech mean? My father is king. So even though he doesn't fully say, I will be king, he does all the kingly things, and you're supposed to think like he is the king. And that's what it sounds like. And it ends with the section calling him Jerubbaal, and it shows you what could have been. What could have been? He was supposed to contend with Baal, but instead he became Gideon, who was a hewer of Israelites and a hewer of idols. So, a couple of last things. Don't give credit to man what God has done, and then reverse that. Don't allow people to give you credit for what God has done. You are a tool, just like Gideon was a tool for what God can do in our lives and with people around us. Don't let what you accomplish through God's hand, don't let that go to your head and uplift yourself and your honor and your ego. Instead, always give credit to God. Reverse, don't give credit to man for what God has done too. There's a lot of people in this world that want to give credit to leaders, church leaders, or church pastors for what God is doing. And that only turns into destruction for the whole church and the whole people. So just keep those things in mind. We will study Abimelech. The next person, along with also Tola and JR as the minor judges. So Judges 9 through chapter 10, verse 5. That's what we'll study next. Thank you all for the comments.